Pielo.
Is allowing artists to update their script in case the technology gets outdated.
Being on chain is something that I think it's more and more important.
For me personally, I feel like we've only touched the surface of what's possible with generative art.
On today's episode, we have Tib. Tib, whose real name goes something like Tib Shaik, though I'm certainly butchering it, is a generative artist and collector. He's also the founder of 256 Art. He's an amazing person. He's released collections under Artblocks Presents, and that's a really big deal in the space. He's also a really interesting person, a generally nice human being, and he has some very interesting insights on generative art and on-chain art. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. And as always, there will be an open edition related to the show, and please let us know if you like the episode or not.
Welcome, Tib. It is an honor, an absolute honor to have you in the show. I'd like to begin with you asking, and I know you must do this every single day, but please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tib. I'm the founder of 256 Art, which is a generative art platform, which right now is actually in the middle of transitioning to be entirely open, which means that any generative artist can release on it, and also fully in-chain, which means that all of the data is stored entirely in-chain. So that means the art, obviously, but also the trades, the libraries, and so on. Then on the other hand, I'm also a generative artist myself, so I do create art myself, which I absolutely enjoy, and it's actually the reason why I created 256 Art as well. And from that perspective, I think now I have, let me think, at least a few works out. Like most of them are on 256, obviously, but I also have a few works on FX Hash and one release on Artblocks, which I'm very excited about. That I managed to get one of my works accepted there. Let's see what else could be interesting. I'm actually originally from Belgium, but right now I live in the country of Georgia. So I think that's also kind of nice to know. And we're actually planning on opening a physical generative art gallery here with a bar and so on. So hopefully soon we'll see and be able to get some people to come over to Georgia and enjoy the gallery.
That's awesome, Tib. Well, I'm a big fan of 256. That's where we met, and we'll definitely talk about that later. But first, I wanted to get an artist perspective on, like, as you know, this mini season is kind of like on the future of NFTs. I mean, the role that NFTs will play in society, and I'm super intrigued, like, by what's the role, like, why is there such an intrinsic connection between, like, NFTs and art? Like, what's your take on why that match, like, ended up so well?
I think it's actually. I think it's not just one factor. I think it's a multitude of different factors. So I think the first one that's really important is just you can verify authenticity, right? Like if you follow the on-chain transactions history, you can know with 100% certainty it was created by that artist. It went through, for example, that collector and another collector and so on before it ended up in my wallet. So you can really verify the authenticity of the artwork. I think this is one really, really important part of why it works so well. And then the second thing is just the fact that it can keep, like, basically the only thing a blockchain is an open ledger, right? That can keep track of transactions. And so if you link that to digital files, so I think most NFTs, they're not fully on-chain, but the same principle still applies. And then on top of that, of course, if you take it one step further, you go with fully on-chain and in-chain NFTs, you have the work there as well. But just in general, I think the tracking and the verification that the blockchain allows for is probably one of the main reasons why art and NFTs work so well together.
That's pretty cool. I also like to think, like, there are a bunch of problems that, like, on-chain technology solve for art, verification for certain being one of them. I also like the idea of, well, royalties being enforced into the work of art. I know that's been quite the dilemma here in NFT land, but I'd like to have your perspective on, yeah, on the whole royalty artist problematic and where that's going.
So it's actually very interesting. So just to give a bit of context, the reason that it's actually very very hard to enforce royalties on chain is because you would have to basically enforce a royalty on every transfer. So that means, let's say you mint something into your hot wallet and you would transfer it to your cold wallet, right? If you would enforce royalties on chain, you would basically have to pay some kind of royalty on that transfer because there is no other way to differentiate between that. So to kind of get around that, there was a standard introduced into that can be used into an ER721 contract, where you basically provide the royalty info. So you're saying to a marketplace, like, hey, look, if a sale happens, send that percentage to that address, right? But then, of course, what started to happen is marketplaces were like, you know what? Let's just not honor that. And that's, yeah, basically caused the whole royalty fiasco. And they were doing that to try to capture market share, which is kind of unfortunate. I wish that there was a good way to enforce royalties on chain. And right now, the best, between brackets, because I really don't like the solution, but the best solution that we have is basically blocking marketplaces that don't honor royalties. And in that case, like for example, OpenSea, they have their custom integration for that, where you can block other marketplaces that don't honor royalties, and then OpenSea will honor royalties as well. But the problem is, by doing so, you're basically taking away a part of the decentralization aspect, right? And yeah, I don't know. For me, it's very tricky. Like, I don't think that anybody should have ownership over your asset. I think that's the whole point of using, like, not the whole point, but a big part of the point of using blockchain technology is that you, as the person who owns it, is the owner, and nobody else can make decisions about what you own. So yeah, it's a tricky. I think it's a tricky situation because on the one hand, I think royalties are very important for artists and one of the big amazing promises that Web3 was offering. And then on the other hand, it's like if we really want to enforce them, now we have to go into a less decentralized kind of like direction. So yeah, it's a tricky question to answer, I think.
I do think you touch on the most important points. Are first, on for me, it's like the value proposition of royalties being something interesting for artists, and that being like the result of that being like lots of artists and creatives will be onboarded to Web3. But I also think on based on your answer and something that's really important when talking to you, it's like the act or the importance of being on chain. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit there, because being on chain is something that I as every day goes by, I think it's more and more and more important, but it does have its implications and cost and whatnot. So what does actually being on chain mean, and like what's the importance of it?
So this is actually quite an interesting question because being on chain kind of means different things for different people. So depending on who you ask, you'll probably get a little bit of a different explanation. But I think right now there is like becoming a little bit of a consensus on that, and there's basically two different terminologies. So you have on-chain and you have in-chain. And so on-chain right now basically means that you can compose the art from all of the data available on-chain, but it's not necessarily composed on-chain itself. So to give you an example of that, with Artblocks, you have the art script that's stored on chain. And so even if Artblocks goes down, you could still, from that art script, regenerate, and the hash, of course, regenerate your artwork off chain if you needed to. And then you have in-chain, which is basically taking all of that multiple steps further. So in-chain means that the art is actually composed and created on-chain. The traits are on-chain, and like any external libraries and so on have to be on-chain as well, because else it's not fully in-chain anymore. So the reason this is important, the on-chain, in-chain, other storage like IPFS and centralized servers debate, is because a lot of collectors right now are not aware that what they're buying is very often not stored on or in chain. So that means that if, let's say, you bought an NFT and the image is stored on a centralized server, if that server goes down, now you basically have an NFT that links to nothing, which is a big problem. So one of the ways to solve that is using IPFS, but in a lot of ways, you actually have the same problems there because usually when a file is stored on IPFS, it's not mirrored by a lot of nodes. Like maybe there's one or two servers, if you're lucky, who are mirroring it. And as long as one server is mirroring it, your file is available. But this, again, incurs costs. So you have to keep paying to keep your files on IPFS. So at some point, people might not do that anymore. Not will, but might not do that anymore. And again, you have the same problem where your file is lost. Then, of course, the beautiful thing with having it on chain is that as long as there is the Ethereum blockchain, your art will be available to some extent. So because you can recompile or recompose your art from the data available that's on chain, which already is a really great step in the right direction, because it means, like, I think right now on Ethereum there's 9,000 validators, which is a really big step up from one on a centralized server, or maybe two or three on IPFS usually. And then, of course, the final step is in chain, which is the best, because it means that your art can also be it's also being created like in the chain, like on chain itself. Like you don't have to like recompile it yourself from the data available. You can just do it entirely in chain itself. But of course, there are also downsides to on and in chain storage, and the main one is that it's fairly expensive. Like if you want to store data on chain, the cost really quickly ramps up, and it means that it's only possible to store relatively small amounts of data. And that actually gets me to the next point, and that's why generative art and NFTs work so well together, is because with generative art, all you need to store on chain is the JavaScript algorithm, which usually is, like, on average, I would say around 20 kilobytes. So if you compare that to an image, for example, that can easily be 2 or 10 megabytes, it's a really big difference, and that's kind of what makes it possible to have generative art fully in chain or on chain.
That's amazing, Tip. So let's say, I know we say this over and over in like the art space in Web3, but like one of the beautiful images, at least with art on chain or in chains, like come to worst, and like if there's no human civilization or whatever or something, like, and there's somehow there manages to be like a ledger of the Ethereum blockchain, and like someone can actually recreate, I don't know, Fidenza 256 or disconnected number 14 or something like that.
Yes, I think that's amazing. To be fair, there is one thing that I find really interesting on that topic, and it seems to be quite often overlooked. So right now, nearly all, not all, but nearly all of generative art works are created with JavaScript, right? It's also kind of like interesting. Like a lot of people seem to forget that, coding languages and how browsers, in the case of JavaScript, interpret them also change over time. So when we're saying, like, okay, we want to have the best preservation possible, it doesn't necessarily mean preserve it forever, because it's just near impossible to do with generative art, just because the technologies around it are changing. But there are, of course, ways to mitigate that, and I think, especially for in-chain, this is an issue, because you compile everything, you create the entire work on chain itself, not just from the data that's available. But what that really like what we're now actually trying to do to mitigate that with 256 art is allowing artists to update their script in case the technology gets outdated. So that means, let's say, 5 years from now, one of my artworks no longer compiles properly because the browser doesn't interpret one of my JavaScript functions correctly anymore. I could update my art script and again kind of extend the lifetime of the art for another so many years, right? Until, maybe some new functionality is obsolete.
Yeah. I do get it, and I love the idea, like the idea of making our art, or making art persist through time. I think that's something interesting. and speaks to, yeah, to the aspirations of Gen Art. I On that note, I wanted to ask you, Steve, like, because it's something I think over and over about. It's like, why is this art movement special? And I know like everyone says this about their art movement and whatnot, but like I do think like generative art and on-chain art and digital art is having a moment thanks to the blockchain. But I wanted to get your an artist perspective on why that's happening.
Oh, that's actually a really, really interesting question. So I think it's actually a combination of a few different factors that really made it like happen right now, I guess. So first of all, like I think like people started with very initial generative art. I think even in the 70s, if I'm right. But back then, of course, there weren't so many artists, and the work was more simple in a lot of ways, because they didn't have artists back then didn't have access to the kind of languages and tools that artists right now have access to. But then, of course, back then it was nearly impossible to live off of that kind of art. So you could make that art, but it was more like a fun thing, like a hobby thing. And okay, if you're really lucky, maybe you'll have an exhibition, or your work will be showcased in a museum. But there was no way to sell that art, right? There was no way to sell that art directly, or maybe you would have some prints or something. But that means it's very difficult to have that as your only art stream. Like most of the artists who were working with that type of art were also doing different types of arts, or had day jobs or anything, right? But then now we have blockchain technology, which basically allows ownership over digital files that can be verified in a decentralized way. And that really allowed, I think, for digital art and also generative art to really like get pushed to the forefront. And I think initially NFTs was mostly just digital art, which I think was already amazing. Just the fact that you can own a digital file and you can prove that you are the owner, even though anybody could make a copy of it. I think that's fantastic. That's such a brilliant concept if you really think about it. And then the next step, of course, with generative art, having that having it possible to have that entirely on chain itself, I think really pushes that to the next level. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, definitely. Ownership is one of the, yeah, it's one of the most beautiful things one can have whilst interacting with digital art. But I also like I sometimes dabble with the idea that like generative art, like something beautiful about generative art, it's one, it's like it's actually made with machines. So that's something that's pretty cool, and I think that we haven't like seen before. And I also think like, well, not seen before, but like, yeah, because as you said, because of blockchain technology, that's something that reached new heights. But I also think that something that's really beautiful about generative art, it's like that the supply is so much bigger, and you can actually have like, I don't know, 100 editions of Disconnected, or 1,000, 10,000 editions of Chromie Squiggles, and they're all different, and like it speaks to much more people being able to get original art, as opposed to, I don't know, there being one Rothko or one Damon Hirst or whatever. I do think like digital art and like generative art speaks to art being available for large amounts of people. I think that's beautiful as well.
yeah, I definitely absolutely agree with that. Like I think like one of the aspects that I personally like love the most about generative works is every time you refresh the algorithm, you get a work that's never been seen before. And if you don't save the hash and you refresh again, that work is gone forever. Like there is something kind of like magical about that, right? Like there's something that only you will ever experience. Like nobody else will ever experience the exact same thing that you did in that moment. And for me, that's so powerful, like I remember when I was doing my exhibition here, actually, like I mentioned in the bar that I'm at right now, we created this kind of like magic box, and it was a white box with a button, and when somebody pressed the button, it would generate a new work, and it would be shown on the projector. And so it was actually Disconnected was one of the two projects that I was showcasing, and it was so incredible to see people like really feel more connected with the work, because they felt, it was theirs, it was their unique experience, their unique visuals, their unique soundtrack that was created, and it was just for them. And you had some people who literally went into the room like by themselves, locked the door, and then we're just like having like a moment with the work, and that's so incredible to see. And you know that they're the only people who will have had that exact experience with that exact piece of work, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, for a technology that's basically based upon storage and like on storing things forever, like the idea of having something that exists just for a moment is beautiful. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and then at the same time, like, because now again you can put it on chain, right? Like, it allows you to capture that moment and keep it forever, if that makes sense.
That's beautiful. Tip, and uh, you were talking about art blocks. Like I know I've spoken about this about art blocks before, and I think it's such a breakthrough moment in the history of generative art. But I'd like to first like have your thoughts on how art blocks change or the innovation art blocks assumes over the art history, and second, I'd like to have your perspective of, because you were actually as like Artblocks published one of your works, so that's amazing, and I've congratulated you before, and I'll do it again, and it's such an amazing, like I can't even imagine what it feels like. So yeah, tell us both what Artblocks means and what it means to be an Artblock artist.
So, it's a really big question to answer, I think. So, to start with, I think what art blocks in some way represents, right? For me at least, it's like if you are selected as a generative artist to release on art blocks, it really feels a little bit, I think, for like the traditional art sphere to get your work on, I don't know, Sotheby's or Christie's or something, right? It feels really like the top of the generative art world appreciates the art that you're creating, which is of course an incredible feeling. And art blocks, because they were the first, or at least one of the first, to have generative art on the Ethereum blockchain, they really managed to grow and keep that position as well through the work that they're doing. I don't know if this is widely known, but actually, if you release with art blocks, there's multiple steps. So first you have to go like through the testing process, then you go to a curation process, and you get in touch with their team, and they help you, with everything that needs help with, basically. Then you have a short Twitter Spaces before the release as well, and so on. And so from like start to end, the whole process in the case of Disconnected, for example, took 4 months. So it's 4 months from application to release, and through that process you really start to connect with the people there, and you realize that they really just love the art. And I think that's something very important for any art platform, that the focus is we love the art and we want to see artists succeed. I think Artblocks really does a really great job at highlighting like the top of the generative art world, and allowing artists to get like in front of an audience.
Yeah, that's yeah. I also love art blogs. I believe most people in the Web3 spaces do. So congratulations again. And on that note of like, because I think platforms are being such an interesting thing subject we're seeing in Web3. You're the founder of 256 Arts, right? Like that. Tell us a bit about the process and like the changes 256 has undergone, and what are your guys' plans for the future?
Oh, we have a lot to talk about if you want to go through all of that, but so I think maybe it makes sense to backtrack a little bit to like the start of 256, because when I was working on like I basically well actually let's go back a bit more. Like when I got into the NFT space, there was after a while, there was just like one thing that bit me, and that was generative art, right? I've been an artist for a while. I've been a developer for for a while as well, but I kind of never thought to combine the two. And then when I first got like in touch with generative art through the NFT space, I was like, holy shit, this is amazing! I want to do this now. And like when I have that in my brain, like my whole being basically gets tuned on what I want to do. And so I just focused on it, and I started playing around, like just having fun. I wasn't taking it too serious yet at the time. I was just like, okay, let's see what I can do, what I can come up with, and so on. And then I had my first work, which sold out. And what I realized is, at that moment in time, for generative artists, it was actually quite difficult to release work on the Ethereum blockchain. Like, at that moment, you could try to get into Artblocks, but Artblocks is very prestigious. So if you're just experimenting and learning and just trying to see what you can do, you didn't really have a place on the Ethereum blockchain to release your work. And no matter what way you turn it, like the best chain for preservation of your art is still Ethereum. And I was like, okay, I think there is like something needed here for these more upcoming artists, right? Who are clearly very, very talented, but aren't like quite at the top yet, if that makes sense. And so then I was like, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna like create my own generative art platform, and I'm gonna look for these super talented upcoming artists and see if they want to release on the platform or want to use it. And one thing that's also like for me personally very important is like a focus on story. Like it's something that I think sometimes is a little bit lacking in generative art. Personally, it's like we can create really technically impressive or really, really beautiful things as artists, but I think at times like the story behind why the work was created gets a bit lost. And to me, that's a really important part of the art itself. And so then I was like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna start, coding it all up. And so I went through a lot of research on smart contract development because I was fairly new to that at the time. And then I just started to go to work basically. And then we got like I first released one of my works to make sure that everything was working fine and nothing was breaking in the contracts and so on. I preferred to do it with one of my works. And that was It's Alive. And it was partially, of course, an ode to the platform coming alive as well. And then the second series was Bidonville by Julien. And to date, this is still like one of my all-time favorite generative art series ever created, basically, because it really has all of the aspects that I'm looking for. Right? It is from an like very talented upcoming artist. The work has so much soul and so much like such a strong story to tell. And so I was like, okay, we're off to a good start, And then over time, of course, we had all of the other artists release on 256, which I'm super grateful for that they decided to choose 256 to release their work on. But if we just go back to why did I start 256, it was basically like I want to give these upcoming artists a good place where they can release their work without having to worry about Solidity, smart contracts, and whatever, because that's not their field of expertise usually.
That's fair, and I think that's something that's pretty a hustle for artists out there, that like in because of the new technology they have to be their own programmers and marketers and community builders and whatnot, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you have to do everything. So if we can alleviate a little bit of that, to really have the artist focus on their art and not on everything else, I think that's very important, and it's something that artists can really benefit from. And actually on that part, it's like one of the reasons that we're going like moving towards a fully open platform right now is to kind of further that same mission, right? Like if you have an open platform and any artist can release on the platform, there is no gatekeeping at all. And now you really like allow artists and actually collectors as well. But let me start from the artist's point of view, to release art without having to worry about, am I going to get selected? Am I going to get curated? I have to go through this super lengthy process. But you can still offer them that Ethereum experience to release their art in the best preservation, like with the best preservation possible. And I think, right now with 256, we're working on a new smart contract, so it's actually almost done. And it allows, we did some tests, and it allows artists to release an entirely in-chain work for as little as $100 on the Ethereum blockchain. Just to give you an example, up to around 1 year ago, the average was maybe almost $1,000. So that's a huge difference. That's also one of the reasons so many artists were going through a platform, because those costs were just way too high. So if we can almost lower that barrier of entry with 10x compared to a year ago, that's of course incredible. And one of the many reasons that now we're able to go into that direction.
Yeah, that sounds like a big win for artists as well. Tib, and can you speak a little bit as to what's your perceived future for both Gen Art and 256?
Those are two different questions. So let me start on generative art. So for me personally, I feel like we've only touched the surface of what's possible with generative art. Most of the works are still static, even though I think I'm actually very happy to see that now more and more artists are experimenting with animations and sound and other aspects that we can do with code. Rather than a very nice static visual. So I think one of the things that will happen in the generative art sphere is just way more crazy experimental stuff. And to that point, right now, like I mentioned, storing, for a very long time, storing big scripts on chain would be very expensive. But with 256 stars, for example, we've now managed to lower that cost so drastically that it will actually allow artists to have a way bigger code base. So for a long time, the limitation was considered to be around 20 kilobytes. I mean, you could do more, but then, it becomes very expensive very quickly. But if we can lower that cost, now you can have scripts that are 60 kilobytes, for example, without being overly expensive. And that, again, allows for a whole bunch of new possibilities of art that can be created and stored fully in chain. So I think that's from the generative art perspective. I'm just very curious to see what kind of crazy art experiences artists will create. So rather than just a still work, I'm really looking forward to it's crazy experimental works that are fully animated or interactive or dynamic in whatever way, right? I'm really looking forward to see what's going to go, what will happen on that part of generative art.
Amazing. Oh, Tib, thank you, man. I mean, it's fantastic, Tib. Thank you so much for taking the time. I could go on for as long as we need to, and it's such an honor to finally have a conversation with you. And yeah, you're an amazing artist, and I do hope to keep on collecting your work, my friend.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that, and my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very glad that I feel a bit honored that you want to host me and that you're collecting my work. Feels amazing. Thank you.
So good.